Hello, this presentation will be on Jean Piaget. The name Jean Piaget rings a bell for many people as he is a leader in modern psychology. Some of his greatest contributions are in the area of child development, pedagogy, and epistemology. But those are far from his only contributions to modern thinking. As a multi-talented thought leader in biology, psychology, pedagogy, and philosophy, looking at his life's work provides a picture of a bright mind who has shaped the modern world. His personal background gives insight into the ways in which his early entry into academia and the life of learning and researching led to his revolutionary developments in the field of psychology and beyond. Childhood and adolescence. Jean William Fitz Piaget was born the first of three children in the city of Neuchâtel, Switzerland, to parents Arthur and Rebecca Suzanne. He was born in the year 1896 in the midst of a city focused on growing its scientific and educational renown. His father was a key figure in this movement. Having a doctorate and working as a professor set him up to be highly influential in the developing city. The relationship with his son Jean was founded on a shared pursuit of learning and obsessive working. Arthur Piaget set up his son Jean to enter into academia with a wealth of connections. On the other hand, Jean was not particularly close with his mother, yet her Protestant faith does shape Jean in large part as an adolescent. Jean attended the local primary school and continued on to grammar school. His academic pursuits were met with high grades throughout his schooling, and his adept mind resulted in a very early start as a researcher. Throughout his early years, Jean's primary interest was the natural world, with a special interest in mollusks. At a very young age, he was beginning to write his findings in research-style reports. At the age of 10, he wrote a 100-page paper on birds, which his dad refuted as mere observation, not a research study. His first published work was a result of a newfound seriousness gained from his father's criticism. He authored a few lines about an albino sparrow for a youth journal, and many claim this to be the start of his life's work. This was published in 1907 when Jean was only 11 years old. Jean sustained involvement in a variety of scientific groups throughout his years in grammar school and was also an assistant of curation in a local natural history museum. One of these groups, the Friends of Nature Club, was started by Pierre Bouvet, a man who became of most importance throughout Jean's career. By the time Jean was headed to university, he was already widely published, writing over 20 articles for scientific journals and well-versed in scientific research and dialogue. Crisis of adolescence. Unfortunately, this early success set Jean up for troubles, as he was overly specialized in his knowledge at such a young age. He got into a debate with another researcher about mollusks and was shown to be lacking in information. This defeat changed the direction of his career as he withdrew from conversations in biology almost entirely. This dislike of being corrected, lectured, or criticized was a lifelong struggle for Jean. This critical moment was part of a larger shift in his work in 1915 in what he would call his crisis of adolescence, leading him to devote the following 5 years to a nearly exclusive study of religion and philosophy. A key factor in this shift was thinking was a Protestant confirmation class his mother required him to attend. The class prompted much curiosity and questioning from the adolescent Jean. The proofs for God presented to him seemed weak and faulty to such a logical scientific mind. This began what would be a lifelong quest for understanding. The resulting conversations Jean had with both his family and the greater society led him to a belief in God, but one that was markedly different from that of his Protestant mother. He sought to bring together logic, spirituality, and morality. He began to form a foundational understanding of Christianity through a constructivist lens. For Jean, God was watching humanity with his hands tied, and man is left to create himself independently of God's intervention. University years. Between 1916 and 17, Jean wrote an autobiographical novel entitled Recherche. The work reflected Jean's new interest in philosophy. Jean was well written in biology and had dabbled in philosophical writings, but this work was his attempt to assert his opinion on the rebuilding of society post-war. To his dismay, the work received strong criticism. Once again, due to this critique, Jean pivots his focus. During this time, Jean was to be enrolled in attending university classes in Neuchâtel. Due to his writing and frequent stays in a small village for health reasons, he rarely attended his classes. Likely because of his father's authority in the university, he was granted permission to continue on in his studies. He made up for lost time in the last 2 years of university by attending a high number of classes and earning some of the highest marks on the exams. It was in the final year that he was exposed to the work of Edouard Claperday's Psychology of the Child, someone he later worked with. Topics such as schooling and the subconscious were also introduced during this period. As we will see, this becomes a catalyst for Jean's most famous work. As he concluded his time in university, Jean received a number of awards for his work with mollusks. Ironically, much of this work had been written during his time in grammar school. He also submitted a thesis on the same topic for a PhD and was awarded the highest score, despite an obvious lack of attention to detail or even care for the work. Speculation leads one to assume that both the awards and PhD grade were because of his father's status. Jean had even written in the introduction to his PhD thesis that he no longer understood the topic at hand, further cementing his shifting focus. Having abandoned hopes of working in philosophy and biology, Jean turned towards psychology. He moved to Zurich in 1918 with hopes of studying with leading psychologists. Here he began to interact with some key influential thought leaders in the field, including Carl Jung and Eugene Bleuler. There is reason to believe that in Zurich, Jean was faced with his own shortcomings. Much of Bleuler's work was around the development of the term autism, meaning a removal of a person from reality. To Jean's dismay, he saw much of himself in the description, and he abruptly ended his time in Zurich after only one semester. He returned to a brief statistical study of mollusks, with a keen view on the psychological dimensions of these creatures. This brief project, along with the realization that in the field of psychology he could be known as great, due to the relative newness of the field, led Jean on to Paris to continue his studies in psychology. One of the professors he was drawn to in Paris was Pierre Janet, and his teaching on the evolution of personality. He was also taken under the wing of Theodore Simon, who was developing tests of intelligence at the lab of Alfred Binet. These mentors were highly influential in shaping Jean's future career. During his early days in Paris, Jean began offering presentations and lectures on psychological topics and engaging with the work of key researchers, including Sigmund Freud. In the work in Binet's lab, it gave Jean a key takeaway about the role of adults in children's learning. Jean said, "Moral judgments by unprofessional adults cause feelings of guilt, thus preventing true morality. Young people, therefore, have to emancipate themselves from coercion, a process that involves conflicts and crises." It was under this sentiment that Jean began to see how psychoanalysis could inform pedagogy. As Piaget was working in Binet's lab, he helped to perform assessments of pupils in the neighboring school. He classified common errors he saw the students making. This system of observation and classification continued on as Piaget observed children in various stages and in various contexts. Early on, he assumed children exhibiting certain behaviors were feeble-minded or atypical, but he went on to recognize patterns that ultimately led to his work in child development. For example, Jean made a key observation while watching an 11-month-old playing with a ball. When the ball rolled under a chair, the child went to retrieve it because he could still see the ball. But when it rolled under a couch with a ruffle around the bottom, rather than looking towards the couch, the child headed back to the chair to look for it. This crucial observation is one key aspect of the developmental stage Jean goes on to identify as the sensory motor stage. Work with the J.J. Rousseau Institute. Piaget's career was accelerated when he was invited to Geneva to be the director of studies at the J.J. Rousseau Institute by Edward Claparede, someone whose work he had already read but did not know personally. While Jean gave credit to the paper he had written and sent to Claparede as motivation for his invitation, he failed to acknowledge his longtime mentor, Beauvais, was the director of Claparede's institute and was much more likely the reason for the invitation. Both of these men are Jean's most significant patrons and enabled Jean to follow his passions in his research. His time at the institute was where his work gained momentum towards his most famous research. The J.J. Rousseau Institute had been founded at the turn of the century to promote the training of teachers in new educational methodology. The goal of new education was social progress. Their motto, "The teacher should learn from the child," was the key to the revolutionary approach to education. The 3-year program grew quickly, attracting attention internationally. The Institute established various programs and research opportunities. After the end of World War I in 1921, when Piaget was hired to conduct research, he was entering into a well-established institution focused on new education. Much of Jean's research upon his arrival at the JJRI consisted of interviews with pupils at local schools. Jean would take the observations and categorize and classify them. He had a particular interest in observing their reasoning and logic and organizing the results based on their faults in logical thinking and expression. The data and information he gathered through these interviews constituted his first books on child psychology. It was in these works that he began to gain acclaim as a researcher of child psychology. focuses of his early writing. One key emphasis in Jean's early child psychology books was the egocentrism of children. He argued that this self-absorption was the central aspect of a child's thought process until the age of 7 or 8. It wasn't until this age that they were capable of possessing a real social life. Between the ages of 3 and 7, children are acquiring the language to communicate, but in Piaget's research, he concluded that during this period, much of their talking lacks an audience and is egocentric. Another aspect, the child's lack of ability to see another's point of view, further developed this topic. In these early writings, he began to note the ways in which authoritarian educational models were incongruent with the development of children. As all of this research began to be circulated, Jean received much praise internationally. While there was also criticism, it was not in such a way as to shut him down, as it had in the past. He just brushed over it and ignored it. Later in life, he agreed that this early work had shortcomings and was in fact quite self-critical of his early work. Personal shifts. In 1924, Jean married one of his colleagues, Valentine Châtenay. She came from a very wealthy family, and she had studied at the JJRI because of her interest in pedagogy. Jean and Val, as he called her, settled into a life of harmony, sharing similar values on most things. In January of 1925, they had their first child, Jacqueline. At this point, Val stayed home to care for their daughter, but she not only cared for her, but also took up the task of documenting her development. This continued on when they had 2 more children in 1927, Lucien, and 1931, Laurent. The work Valentine did in recording the children's developments was key to Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Not only was his life changing as he built a family, but his work at the JJRI ended due to financial problems. Although the Rockefeller Foundation stepped in to provide funding shortly after, Jean had already moved on to a job at the University of Neuchâtel as the chair of philosophy, a role he shared with Beauvais. Although he stayed in this role for 8 semesters, he was relieved when he was offered an opportunity to return to Geneva as a member of the Faculty of Sciences in the university. The work in philosophy was not his area of interest. He preferred the study of how philosophy could be merged with and informed by the work of psychology. For the next 10 years, Jean studied, researched, and taught in various scientific fields, including psychology, sociology, and biology. He also continued to explore pedagogy and the influence of religion and morality. This period is when the majority of his crucial contributions were birthed. This paper will look at some of the most important ones, especially as they relate to the field of education. Pedagogy. When looking at Jean's pedagogy, we see his primary aim as focusing self-determined personalities capable of collaboration. First, by looking at the modern problems Piaget saw in education, he was able to apply his research to create a pedagogical model he believed best met this aim. The misunderstanding of how children's brains function in contrast with the adult's brain was the primary problem. While both groups appear to act similarly at times as they seek to meet their needs, in reality, Jean had developed an understanding that the child's cognitive processes were far different from that of the adults. Thus, the approach to developing their minds had to be different. He understood any relationship between the child and adult to tend toward authoritarianism because of this different thinking style. The solution he proposed in the field of pedagogy was a hands-off approach that allowed children to develop a morality amongst themselves, which he believed to be the most possible when the teacher was less involved. The teacher was not obsolete, but rather than primarily relaying information, the job of a teacher ought to be stimulating the mind of the children through suggestion and introduction of ideas to be considered. The teacher's personality, in Jean's view, is of most importance. When they possess a morality, they are approachable and easily engage the children. Jean, along with others at the JJRI, believed children should be allowed to pursue topics of interest to them, rather than a prescribed curriculum. Through hands-on materials that they could manipulate, children were enabled to form their own experiences around these topics. In the elementary school, this aligned with the methodology of Maria Montessori, and Jean would agree that this model should be utilized. Another distinction of this active school approach was discouraging individual competition through exams or traditional assessments of knowledge. Rather, they were encouraged to use practical, performance-based assessments. While Piaget's approach to pedagogy was well circulated, it is important to note that he did not want to be known for this work. In particular, at the end of his life, he was not interested in recognitions for these contributions. When looking at the breadth of his work, it is clear that while he had published about 1,000 pages on the work of pedagogy, this was only 3% of his total work. That said, Jean did care deeply about revolutionizing the world of education and was involved in several organizations working towards education reform. His vision was that his psychological work would inspire the transformation of education. Stages of child development. Piaget's crowning work was the formulation of the 4 stages of child development. Jean desired to create a system of understanding to explain the differences in children and adults' thinking. This belief in developmentally shifting thinking patterns distinguished him from most other psychologists. That said, he did build on the work of others such as Baldwin, Binet and Simon, Stern, and Janet. As a psychologist, Jean saw the need for categorization to communicate the stages, but he also recognized that while the categories can be helpful, the exact ages are a bit arbitrary, and children may be a year different in their development and still very much be typical. Another important aspect in the understanding of his stages is that they are not behavioral or knowledge-based. Rather, the stages describe an underlying process of thinking and cognitive organization. As each stage is explained, the emphasis is on deeper thinking, but some behaviors or evidences of thinking will be included to enhance understanding. The 4 stages are sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Each stage is passed through in succession and is aligned with age brackets. The overall focus of the 4 stages is children's ability to reason and think logically as they progress. The first stage, sensory motor, refers to babies until they reach the age of 2 and develop language and an understanding of symbolism. In this stage, children are discovering a schema for movement and senses, hence the name. This period also includes developing an understanding of spatial and temporal systems and the concept of object and causality. Children begin learning and engaging with the world through reflexes, and slowly these form into habits. Much learning at this stage occurs through engaging the children's immediate surroundings as they learn the distinction between themselves and the environment. At the culmination of this stage, children understand object permanence. An object hidden in the hand of an adult can still be located mentally. As they are moving out of this stage, they begin to move to a symbolic level. The next stage that children pass through is the pre-operational stage, from the age of 2 through 7. This stage is characterized by the initiation of representational thought. Mental images and actions are assigned verbal meanings. This integration of speech allows for a widening knowledge of past and future. The 2 substages are symbolic thought and intuitive thought. The shift between the 2 occurs around the age of 4 or 5. Drawing and symbolic play are some key manifestations of the first substage. The second substage is when logical thinking develops, and was Piaget's most researched segment of development. Children now are beginning to center intuitive thought. Their understanding of categorization and grouping is beginning, yet has some faults due to unfounded logic. The simple tasks, such as ordering sticks by size, is something they are capable of, but if you gave them additional objects to add to their lineup, they would be unable to complete the task. Socially, children at this stage are only able to see things from their own point of view. The final development is a basic sense of quantity, along with a basic understanding of conservation. The third stage, concrete operational, from ages 7 to 11, we see children establish a firm sense of logical thinking that can be applied more flexibly for a variety of situations when concrete objects are involved. The children are no longer exclusively egocentric, but instead find that others can possess differing points of view. They also begin to grasp concepts such as time and number. Their ability to focus on multiple elements of a situation also emerges. This is known as decentration. This ability allows children a greater ability to classify things based on multiple factors. Finally, the last stage of development, which begins at the age of 11 and lasts until about 15 or 16, is called the formal operational stage. At this point, children, now adolescents, are capable of reflecting on their own thought and reasoning, as well as engaging in conversations about the theoretical and hypothetical. Deductive reasoning and more abstracted logic are also employed. The scientific processes come alive to them. Epistemology. Piaget worked tirelessly towards writing an epistemological theory as a foundation to all sciences. This work was published in 1950 in a 3-volume collection entitled Introduction à l'épistémologie Génétique, or the Introduction to Genetic Epistemology. Not only did he contribute in his writings to this conversation, but he also established the International Center for Genetic Epistemology at the University of Geneva. It was a hub for his own research, as well as a center for interdisciplinary collaboration. While Piaget's contributions to the philosophical conversation were never met with great reception, this work is worth noting as his development of the ICGE was innovative and proved to be the context of much of Piaget's later work. The center was only closed after his death. End of career. In 1971, Jean resigned from the University of Geneva, but he was not ready to retire. He continued on working with the International Center for Genetic Epistemology. For 8 more years, he continued to be involved in research and thought around the topics that made his career. But in 1979, his health declined, and in 1980 he died, leaving behind a legacy he hoped would continue inspiring others towards greatness. Major contributions to education and art education. While Jean's many contributions to the field of education could fill pages, here is a summary of the few major contributions. His theory of cognitive development is a cornerstone of how children's learning process is understood in modern psychology. He also was a pioneer for the clinical method of child psychology, as he chose to watch and engage with children as his primary means of research. Finally, he emphasized the importance of child-centered learning and essentially created constructivist pedagogy. This last aspect is most notable in the field of art education. He is considered the father of constructivism, and while it can be applied to all domains of learning, it lends itself quite naturally to arts education. The constructivist approach values learning through experiencing the world. The art classroom is rarely a place of rote memorization, but instead a space where children are engaging in hands-on, experiential learning. Constructivist pedagogy also highly values self-reflection, something artists regularly participate in when critiquing their own work, a task many arts educators also encourage their students to practice. Jean is quoted as saying, "Education for most people means trying to lead the child to resemble the typical adult of his society. But for me, and no one else, education means making creators. You have to make inventors, innovators, and nonconformists." Jean Piaget himself was an innovator and nonconformist. He saw things differently and constructed his own path. His work deeply impacts all educators today, and will hopefully continue to inspire and challenge educators to focus on enabling students to pursue their creative ideas. Throughout the life of Jean Piaget, one constant thread can be drawn, a curiosity to observe and understand. As is clear to all who study his work, his deep understanding of how young children think and develop is both insightful and helpful. Along with his work in the fields of pedagogy and philosophy, Jean Piaget gives educators much to consider as they look at their own methodologies and approaches to teaching young minds.